Welcome, dear friends of Books and Voices of Revelation. Next, we have the narration of the following audiobook. They Got Married, and They Were Helpful, by Arnoldo Canclini. Part 1. Sadness Transformed into Joy. Hudson Taylor and Mary Dyer. James Hudson Taylor may be regarded as one of the greatest missionaries to have gone to the East. He came to China in 1854, at the age of 22, as a worker in the Society for the Evangelization of China. Years later, he founded the China Inland Mission, which is now one of the most important missions in the world. Its purpose was to evangelize the regions beyond the 5 cities on the coast, the only places where foreigners, including missionaries, were allowed to settle. That great man, of whom we may say that in him he taught the Christian world how to adapt itself to the needs of China, found the companion of his life, at the age of 25, 2 years after his arrival in the labor camp, in the city of Ningpo. He found it in the person of a young missionary of 19, whose name was Mary Dyer. She had been born in Penang, Malacca, and had been an orphan for several years. Her father, Samuel Dyer, a missionary in China, had died when she was very young, and her mother when she was 10 years old. A loving uncle had taken her in, along with an elder sister and brother, educated in England, and managed her money, which, without being a great fortune, enabled the 3 little Dyers to support themselves by their own means. Miss Aldersey, a fervent lady of his acquaintance, who was also possessed of certain means, offered Maria and her sister Birella a place at the school she maintained at Ningpo. Mary had not yet surrendered herself to the Lord, but with the feeling that this would have been the most fervent desire of her revered father, she agreed to go to China. During the journey, he found the way of salvation, and his heart was filled with holy order and consecration, after being converted from the ways of the world to the ways of God. She was still very young, and the prospect of a long life ahead led her to give herself body and soul to the Lord who had saved her. By the time Santiago Hudson Taylor moved to Ningpo, Maria had begun to collaborate with the Jones couple, newly arrived missionaries, who had managed to get in touch with influential figures in Chinese society. The young woman's profound knowledge of the language, which she had mastered since childhood, made her an invaluable help. Although his occupation was purely educational, he never lost sight of the fact that his fundamental mission had to be to win souls, and therefore to work in teaching at his side was in reality to evangelize constantly. Much later, Hudson Taylor said, "That's what got me interested." She was very spiritually minded, as evidenced by her work. Even then I was a true missionary. It could not fail to happen that the 2 young men met from time to time, since they were part of the very small group of missionaries in Ningpo. Add to this the fact that he lived alone, and that therefore his visits to colleagues were very frequent. Very soon he was attracted by the frankness and naturalness of the young woman, who proved to have ideas similar to his own, though these in general differed quite a bit from those held by others, especially in practical respects. Unbeknownst to him, Mary began to occupy a place in his heart that had hitherto been empty. James tried desperately to push the beloved image out of his mind. The unevangelized interior called him so clearly that he could not doubt that this was the voice of God. Added to this was his conviction that, in such a task, a wife and a home could only be an impediment. Moreover, his financial situation was another obstacle to the idea of marriage. Knowing that the missionary society he had sent to China was in debt, he had voluntarily stopped receiving his salary, partly to help the organization and partly because he believed it was not Christian to incur debt. That position caused him to break away from the mission not long after. The help of some English friends had kept him up to that point, but he could not think of subjecting another person to such a regimen of life. At that time, as so often, internal strife was shaking large regions of China, and, as an indirect consequence of this, Santiago had to return to Shanghai, with the pain of leaving the woman he loved in silence in a dangerous situation. That pain was not only for him, for a new feeling had also begun to burn in Mary's heart. Although surrounded by people who cherished and admired her, she had never felt true love, and her conscience and heart told her that this need would be fulfilled in the young and lonely missionary. It was hard for him to comprehend, and he didn't realize it until, to his great joy, James returned to Ningpo a short time later. To no one did he speak of his secret, but only to God, who alone could understand it. Hudson Taylor's conduct provoked nothing but criticism. Some criticized him for wearing Chinese clothes, others for trying to accommodate himself to the customs of the people, and still others for his ideas about the administrative problems that reduced him almost to poverty, yet he incessantly helped the destitute in his path. And it was precisely all this, strange and original, that she admired and, let us say it in passing, that proved to be the path for him to become one of the greatest missionaries of all time. For this reason, she prayed constantly for her friend, although she tried to hide her feelings in front of him. Thus the months passed, in which she did not stop working for a single day, praying at the same time for this young man who had invaded her heart, asking God to help her to understand him, to imitate his devotion, to be worthy of his love, if she could ever aspire to such great happiness. And suddenly came the great and unexpected joy. A letter, it was from him. It was the letter. She hadn't been wrong. God had created them for each other, and there was the proof. With such an important news in her heart, Mary could no longer be silent and ran to tell her sister that she had just become engaged to a missionary. Then they both went to carry the news to Miss Aldersey, who was practically their spiritual mother. Terrible was the surprise when the proposal was received in a very different way from what they expected. Miss Aldersey had been pleased with Burella's engagement, but in Maria's case she burst out with indignation. Taylor! That young, poor, disjointed Mr. Nobody! How dare he pretend such a thing? It follows by its own weight that this proposition must be immediately and definitively rejected. Mary did her best to explain to him how much good she found in her suitor. But it was all in vain. Nothing could convince the inexorable Miss Aldersey, and as a result the young lady wrote, almost at her dictation, a letter in which she terminated the affair and firmly declared her desire that it should be spoken of no more. For both of them that was a hard blow, which they had to endure apart from each other. Perhaps it was more painful for her, younger, more inexperienced, and more deprived of comfort. James wrote to his sister, "We need patience, and our faithful God leads us into experiences in which, sustained by His blessing, we can cultivate that virtue in us. Though at times it seems that we are tried beyond endurance, we never find that God is unable or ill-disposed to help and sustain us, and if our hearts were entirely subject to His will, desiring that it alone should be accomplished, how much more scanty and lighter would our afflictions seem to us." Every day Santiago had to pass twice near the school where she lived, now run by Mrs. de Borzum, and he could not help casting a glance, in case he caught sight of her. That possibility was made a reality one day by a kind spirit who knew and loved them both, Mrs. Jones. Having understood the affection that united the two young men, he had no qualms about giving them an opportunity to see each other. She invited Maria to collaborate with her again, and since Hudson Taylor was already doing it, it was logical that they would meet more than once. But Miss Aldersey heard of the affair, and at the close of a prayer meeting of the women missionaries, she rebuked Mrs. Jones for the attitude which outraged her. He went so far as to get his colleague to promise him that James and Mary would never see each other again at his house. Of course, the lady did not do so, but merely assured her irate friend that she would do nothing to influence these much-discussed relations, and that she would prevent the young men from taking advantage of their meetings there to see each other alone. She herself informed James of her promise, who then felt bound by it, so that it was morally impossible for him to write to Mary or seek an interview with her. But it was only in these days that he learned that Miss Aldersey was not related to his beloved, and that he had no authority over her, which was quite a revelation to him. So he decided to summon the two sisters and ask them if he could write to his uncle in London asking for Mary's hand. He immediately went to the school to catch sight of the two young women who were leaving, so he asked them for a few moments of conversation. Burella took the floor, asking him to come in, while she asked Mrs. de Borzum's permission. But when she appeared, Santiago discovered that both young women had quickly left through another door. Burella had guessed the visitor's purpose and pressured her sister to adopt that attitude, which Maria accepted in order to avoid a definitive rupture. He then did only one thing. She returned home and knelt before the Lord, imploring His guidance and help for both her and him. That anomalous situation was short-lived. On a sultry summer day, the women missionaries gathered again for one of their regular prayer meetings. At that time, it was to be done at the workplace of Hudson Taylor and the Joneses. Before it was finished, a storm broke out, flooding the neighboring streets and covering the bridge that linked that neighborhood to the rest of the city. The missionaries had to wait a long time before they could leave, and the same thing, though in reverse, happened to James and Mr. Jones on the other side of the bridge. By the time they were able to arrive, almost all the visitors had left, but a servant informed them that Mrs. de Borzum and Maria were still there. Mr. Jones made up his mind. "Go to my desk," he said to his partner. "I'll see if it's possible to arrange an interview." The minutes of waiting were few, but the impatient lover found them immeasurable. His friend returned, saying that Mrs. de Borzum and Maria were alone with his wife, and that they would have great pleasure in conversing with him for a moment. Without even thinking about what he would say or do, Santiago quickly went up to the first floor, where the visitors were, and there he found himself face to face with his beloved. It is true that there were other people, but his eyes and thoughts were not enough for him except for her. So it's no wonder that, at that moment, I told him everything that is possible to say, in public and, perhaps, something else. His plan was simply to ask his uncle's permission to write, but without noticing it, he let all the torrent in his heart spill out. And her? The same thing happened to her, perhaps most remarkably, for she also let her words flow without mastering them, thinking that those around them were her sincere friends, who sought the good of both. The others listened in silence. Hudson Taylor was in charge of putting the final point, worthy of him and his companions. "Now let us put everything before the Lord in prayer." And the letter was written. The response took several months, because of the great distances, and during that time, they did not feel free to see or write to each other. Besides, it was not advisable for them to do so as not to exasperate Miss Aldersey still more. This had been informed by Mary herself, and the disgust she felt was inerrant. Sincerely convinced that this was not the candidate that corresponded to her young friend, and her idea strengthened by Santiago's break with the mission that supported him, for reasons of conscience, she resolved to do everything in her power to prevent the wedding. The first thing was to write to Maria's uncle, piling up bad reports about the suitor. Almost all of them, of course, dealt only with practical points of view and not with moral or spiritual views. She was also not reluctant to make her opinions known to everyone around her. The Chinese garb worn by Hudson Taylor was the subject of the sharpest criticism, and no less so was his position of absolute dependence on God for money, which made him a fanatic who cannot be trusted, sick in body and soul, in a word, utterly unworthy. As the months went by, these sayings circulated among the Europeans of Ningpo, and Santiago found himself more and more alone. In his isolation, he would no doubt meditate many times on the future, which appeared to him isolated from everyone and everything, united only to God and to the hope of a satisfactory response from Mary's uncle. What if the opposite happened? It was very difficult to know which way to go then. It was very probable that this distant gentleman was influenced more by Miss Aldersey, whom he knew, than by a stranger, poor and lonely, such as he was. But, on the other hand, he was so sure that it was God's will that he should marry this young woman that he waited calmly and confidently. The same was true of her. Once, for example, he was visiting the home of the Goff missionaries, who had great sympathy for James. Mr. Goff spoke of the young man, showing him such appreciation that Mary's heart was filled with longing. From there he went straight to his room, where he remained on his knees for a long time, in silent pain. He had his Bible within his reach, and taking it up, he found these words from Psalm 62 verse 8, "Hope in him at all times, O peoples. Pour out your hearts before him, God is our refuge." There he found his consolation, and even many years later he often drove the pain out of his soul by reading that passage and observing the now blurred lines with which he had marked it that night. As time went on, the date approached when it was logical for the answer to come. To make matters worse, he fell ill, and in his bed the memory of Mary presented itself to him incessantly. In a letter to his sister, he recounted nocturnal reveries as follows. "Suddenly I felt the presence of my dear Mary. She came quietly, like a zephyr, and I felt that such rapturous tranquility that I knew she must be there. I felt spellbound for a short time, but at last, without opening my eyes, I stretched out my hand, and she took it so warmly and softly that she could not help a look of gratitude. He forbade me to speak and put his other hand on my forehead, and I felt the headache that had been tormenting me and the fever go away under his touch and disappear as if they had gone under the pillow. He whispered to me not to be uneasy, that she was mine and I was hers, and that I should stay still and try to sleep. And so I did, waking up a few hours later, free from my fever, though very weak. A sweet dream I would call it, only I was as wide awake as I am now, and I saw her and felt her touch as clearly as I do now, that of pen and paper. All my fear during the fever had been that our love would be reduced to nothing, so you can imagine how that reassured me. For months later came the answer. It was favorable. Mary's uncle, a prudent and sensible man, had not been influenced either by James's letter or by Miss Aldersey's. She had sought out all who could give her information about her niece's suitor, and absolutely all of them did so favorably. The authorities of the Society for the Evangelization of China spoke eloquently of his fervor, his consecration, and his steadfastness. Therefore, putting aside all rumors, he consented to his niece's marriage on the sole condition that she should wait for her coming of age. And that was only less than 3 months away. Joy made him leap with enthusiasm, but doubt soon arose as to his immediate duty. It was impossible to go and look for Mary, and it was absurd to think of bringing her home. What to do? Again a loving heart appeared to help him. Who knows how Mrs. Knowlton, an American missionary, found out what was going on? She had two virtues: she supported the union of the two young men, and she lived in a beautiful and secluded place. She decided to send a note asking Maria to come and see her, and if it turned out that there was anyone else in her house at the time, well, such coincidences happen everywhere, even in China. And so, in Mrs. Knowlton's drawing room, he waited for the messenger to come to the girl's house and return to her. Far away he could distinguish the beloved figure. Impatiently he watched her slowly approach, watched her as she entered the house, followed the sound of her footsteps on the stairs, opened the door for her, at last. Alone at last, for the first time, while he let the magnificent contents of that letter flow from his lips. Even many years later, the joy of that moment had not left him. For decades had passed when he wrote, we sat next to each other on the couch, with his hand in mine. My love for her has never cooled. It hasn't cooled down to the present. They got engaged immediately and set about preparing for their next wedding. These were months of joy and nervousness, but they in no way signaled a diminution in his effectiveness in Christian service. 15 days before the wedding, he thought it appropriate to remind his future wife of his financial situation, which depended absolutely and solely on God, through his servants, from whom he never asked for money. Mary's sweet voice interrupted him. Have you forgotten, she exclaimed, that as a child I was abandoned as an orphan in a distant land? God has been my father all these years, and do you think I'll be afraid to trust him now? My heart was leaping for joy, he said as he recounted it. And rightly so, because the price of such a woman is much higher than that of rubies. The wedding took place on January 20, 1858. He dressed in his Chinese costume and she in a simple grey silk dress. A week later, Santiago's diary read, we are so happy. The Lord himself has turned our sorrow into joy, giving us the reward of praise to the Spirit of heaven. He has answered all our prayers, overcome the opposition of those who wanted to separate us, justified the trust that he had led us to put in himself, and it has made us very, very happy. And 6 weeks later, back in the field. To be married to one who is truly loved and loved with the greatest tenderness and devotion. This is a blessing that goes beyond the power of words to express it or imagination to conceive it. There are no disappointments there. And every day, as the mind of the loved one shows itself more, when we have a treasure like mine, we feel more satisfied, happier, more humbly grateful to the giver of all good, the best of his earthly gifts. The end. End of this first half.